Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. If an Imperial class Star Destroyer appeared over Manhattan today, this massive 1.6 kilometer long ship would span 20 blocks north to south. This was not just a simple vessel, this wasn't even a ship that us puny Earthlings could understand. Even the mightiest ships here on our planet, like the Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, could hardly register as anything larger than a frigate in the Imperial Navy. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer was not just a simple battleship. It was a freaking city. A gigantic triangle-shaped city that could eclipse even the Empire State Building with its height. This destroyer had a crew of over 40,000, which would make this ISD one of the most densely populated areas on our planet. There's even an internal rail system that can move people and equipment around throughout the ship very efficiently, like the subway system. And so naturally, you would think it would take a very special type of individual to actually command one of these ships. An individual who's not only comfortable with commanding a warship, but an individual who also has the political and managerial skills to essentially run an entire city. To be the captain of an Imperial-class Star Destroyer is truly a unique role in the Imperial Navy that very few people actually are qualified to do. But interestingly enough, a lot of the individuals we see in this position are oftentimes the biggest, elitist assholes in the fleet, and a good portion of them are quite incompetent. And that's most likely due to just how crazy of a path an Imperial must take to get to this position in the first place. One of Palpatine's finest achievements was setting up a training pipeline that could sort and find the most capable, ambitious, and also vicious individuals in the Empire and basically create a role for them in the Imperial military. The system starts at the local level, with junior academies and school systems which were all standardized and subjected to a federal testing regime that was designed to identify intelligent and talented students. The highest scoring children in each sector were given an opportunity to attend an Imperial-run senior academy. Depending on which sector you were in, the number of children accepted to senior academies was quite different. There were usually more slots open in the core, where you had higher populations and more Imperial loyalists. In former separatist regions or more sparsely populated regions, you had a much lower amount of slots available. Every academy was slightly different and had very different levels of prestige and instructors, but some were definitely very famous, like the Royal Imperial Academy on Coruscant and the Arcanus Academy. But this wasn't just a purely merit-based system. This is all thanks to Emperor Palpatine's Sith mentality, which is quite destructive. There was this extreme culture of competition that existed outside of the official rulebooks. While it was illegal for cadets to cheat or attack and sabotage their fellow students, it occurred quite frequently. As long as cadets were not caught doing something nefarious, usually instructors looked the other way, even if they had proof that someone was doing something wrong. And that's because a lot of the instructors in these schools oftentimes had to bully and cheat their way to the top as well. Such was the culture that Palpatine wanted to create from the top down. It's very similar to the Sith academies of old. I recommend you guys check out the Bane series for a better insight on that. Sith academies were basically like Harry Potter, but everyone's in Slytherin. When you have a hierarchical structure like the Empire's, people become obsessed with strength and power. Even individuals who don't naturally desire it, because behind the orderly, disciplined presentation that the Empire gives off was an extremely dangerous and chaotic system. Even though the Imperial Academy system and military were weighed down by bureaucracy and regulations, there was oftentimes a lack of enforcement of these rules, or at least proper enforcement. What you had instead were individuals weaponizing these rules to attack their enemies and opponents in their own pursuit of power. And so people sought power not just because they were ambitious, but because this is how the system worked, and if they wanted to survive or protect themselves and their friends, they needed power. Because individuals not only dropped out, they oftentimes died. And so the people who made it to the top of this sad excuse of a military academy system were not always the smartest or brightest or even most capable. They were instead the biggest social climbers, the most ruthless psychopaths, murderers, and oftentimes individuals with very rich parents, or at least parents with a lot of political influence. This is at the core of the reason why the Imperial military was always a mess. Trust and the willingness to sacrifice for each other, teamwork, is what builds unit cohesion. And now most Imperials were normal individuals, but if you have enough of these crazy people amongst your ranks, it completely poisons and muddies the water and changes the culture of your institution. And so instead, what the Imperial military got was an officer corps made up of a bunch of self-serving rank climbers ready to turn on their colleagues at a moment's notice for small bits of personal gain, either because they were really ambitious and selfish or because they were simply afraid and everyone else was doing this. Now, of course, there were very talented individuals who naturally made it to the top of the ranks. Thrawn had to go through a lot of struggles navigating through the Imperial system, although he specifically faced racism from other cadets because he was blue. At the same time, a lot of these cadets would actually try to injure him and fight him outside of the class because he was at the top of the ranks in the class. Bullying and hazing was rampant, and while the individuals who survived this treatment in the academy system oftentimes became stronger because of this crazy culture, at the same time, I wonder how many very intelligent individuals who might be mentally or physically weak were destroyed by this type of hazing. They might not have made great commanders, but they could have been terrific analysts or bridge officers. Now, individuals who made it to the top of their class in senior academy could have further education in a specialized Imperial academy that was basically a training pipeline for the various armed services in the Empire. One example of this was Sky Strike Academy, where cadets were trained to be elite TIE fighter pilots for the Navy. For future Imperial class Star Destroyer captains, the specialized training they would get would be to learn how to become bridge officers. This part of their training was far more technical and on the job. This is where Han Solo failed out of pilot training as a TIE heavy pilot. He was more focused on saving the lives of his comrades rather than finishing the mission. He also destroyed way too much Imperial equipment. And once the cadets who were on the command track graduated from that third level of schooling, they were basically assigned as junior officers, usually on a ship of some kind. The Imperial Navy featured thousands of different types of ships, ranging from tiny one-seater TIE fighters to large converted civilian freighters like the Gazanti-class cruiser. There are also specialized ships like the Cantwell-class arrestor cruiser and more flexible multi-purpose platforms like the Toyota Hilux. But at the core of Imperial naval doctrine, the pride of the fleet was the Imperial-class Star Destroyer. If you take a close look at the ship, it doesn't really make sense when it comes to how it's set up, especially if you take into account modern ship-to-ship combat. It features mainly turbolasers and ion cannons, which only have line-of-sight attack abilities. And the complement on board were extremely short-range interceptors that really were just there for screening enemy fighters. Compare that to the Venator-class Star Destroyer, which fielded hundreds of hyperdrive-equipped fighters. The ISD, in most conventional ship-on-ship engagements, would get destroyed before it even got close to a Venator, unless the ISD could somehow bypass the Venator's screen of ARC 170 fighters and somehow jump right alongside it. But here's the thing, the ISD never had to fight Venator-class Star Destroyers. It never really had a near-peer enemy in those early years. What the Imperial-class Star Destroyer really was an extension of the Tarkin Doctrine, which was all about achieving obedience throughout the galaxy through the threat of force. And so these ships were built to be massive, to be seen not just by the enemies of the Empire, but also by the citizens of the galaxy. The Loyalists will be inspired by the might of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, and potential dissidents will have their dreams of rebellion smashed as this 1 mile long ship eclipses the stars above them. The Empire built roughly 25,000 of these massive vessels, and every individual assigned to captain one of these ships was thoroughly vetted and screened. And more importantly, they needed to show that they had brought into this political system and the Tarkin Doctrine itself. This was not merely just a battleship, it was a symbol of Imperial dominance. Should any pirate or rebel even make a scratch on its gray Durasteel hull, it's as if the very Emperor himself was slashed across the face. In many ways, the Imperial-class Star Destroyer was the Empire. No matter where it went, that's what people were reminded of. This means that the captain of an Imperial-class Star Destroyer must be willing to do anything to protect that image, whether it's sending dozens of TIE fighter pilots to their death or calling out an orbital bombardment on their ground team because they're about to get overwhelmed. And remember guys, unlike smaller ships, the captain of an ISD also controls a contingent of 10,000 stormtroopers, along with vehicles and logistics personnel that keep them operational. You weren't just in charge of a vessel. As a captain of an ISD, you were in charge of an army, an entire theater of war. Ideally, the only individuals serving as captains for these ships were the most competent, the highest graduates, the most loyal individuals, the people who understood the Tarkin Doctrine the best. An Imperial-class Star Destroyer captain should not only be extremely experienced at commanding a ship of this size, but also understand the unique logistical needs of an ISD. This is one of the most expensive ships to keep in operation. They also have to understand the political ramifications of their actions and how to command an entire legion of stormtroopers. Unfortunately, because of the corruption that was rampant through the Imperial military structure and just how flawed this system was, most captains of the ISD were not Thrawn. Instead, they were individuals cut in the shape of Cassius Constantine, a captain of many Imperial-class Star Destroyers. He was born on Coruscant You could tell by his accent, and his parents were wealthy. They most likely bribed officials to get him into the famed Anaxis War College. Constantine was amongst the first generation to graduate after the Clone Wars. In a lot of ways, individuals like him were responsible for driving the Imperial fleet's culture and way of operating for many years to come. And guess what the Imperial military mostly handled during its first decade of existence? Well, the Navy fought pirates, separatists, and occasionally even their own people, but rarely was there a threat large enough to actually put an Imperial-class Star Destroyer in real danger. So officers like Constantine were never truly tested until the early years of the Galactic Civil War. For most of their career, they've only known peace and complete dominance over their enemies. And such captains became arrogant and comfortable in their positions. They had neither respect nor fear of their enemies. This is why you could see in a lot of early rebel raids, including the Battle of Scarif and also during the Battle of Yavin 4, Imperial naval commanders often failed to deploy starfighter cover even as rebel X-Wings started their strafing runs on Imperial positions. This generation of captains were simply not ready for combat.
Are we blind? Deploy the garrison! No!
The peace that the Empire enjoyed in those first 10 years meant that there was incompetence all throughout the higher ranks of the Empire. A lot of these captains excelled at the political game that came with higher ranking positions. What they lacked was pose during the middle of a battlefield or an understanding of tactics and strategy. We have to remember that although 25,000 Imperial-class Star Destroyers sounds like a lot, there were billions of Imperial personnel, and so these positions were traded around by Imperial officers and higher-ranking leaders in the military structure like commodities. And a lot of these positions ultimately ended up being political appointments as much as they did appointments based on merit. You look at individuals like Admiral Kendall Ozzel, who ascended to the position of Admiral despite a career full of failures that ranged all the way back to the Republic Navy days. But he was from an important Caridian bloodline. His family was extremely wealthy, and more importantly, Kendall Ozzel's family supported Palpatine's rise to power. And so he was placed in a high position in Vader's Death Squadron and would ultimately botch the entire Hoth invasion plan. Kendall Ozzel has failed upwards his entire life somehow. I mean, before joining the Death Squadron, he was a captain of an Imperial-class Star Destroyer known as Reprisal, and he was tasked with blockading a planet that potentially had a rebel listening post, and he was actually tricked into helping the rebels when he basically attacked a bunch of pirates that were attacking an old Corellian freighter. That Corellian freighter ended up being the Millennium Falcon. Admiral Cassius Constantine also had a career of failure that led to the destruction of several ISDs beneath his command, the escape of rebel fugitives ranging from the Spectres to Mon Mothma, the leader of the freaking rebellion. He even once caught Darth Vader in a tractor beam accidentally. I don't know how he didn't get choked out for that. And he ultimately died during the Battle of Atollon when he disobeyed Thrawn's order and left his position and got his ship rammed by a desperate rebel commander. That action would collapse the entire Imperial blockade and allow key rebel figures to escape into hyperspace. There were, of course, competent ISD commanders in the Empire as well. Individuals like Zamiel Lennox, captain of the destroyer Tyrant. He was a very solid captain and tactician, and he cared a lot about his own crew, much more than his own political advancements, which unfortunately for the Empire meant that Kendall Ozzel would skip ahead of him and captain the Executor after Vader choked out Cassio Tag. You also had individuals like Sienna Rhee, Ray Sloan, Teresa Carell, who all were lifted out of poverty by the Empire and served the Navy with honor and dedication. There's also, of course, the tactical genius known as Thrawn. Now, it's kind of hard to say what percentage of ISD captains were actually competent, which percentage were just complete buffoons, and which percent were average. I'm sure there are a lot of those as well. But it doesn't really matter what the number is if you have enough of them. If you have enough incompetent individuals like Constantine and Ozzel, it just takes a few idiots to lose some pivotal battles, some pivotal ships to turn the entire tide of the war. So there you have it, guys. That is my video for today. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time.